What is going on, everybody, and welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush episode review. Today, guys, we are going to be discussing episode 9 of Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush. I'm very excited to be discussing this episode with you guys, so without further ado, let's get right into it. So, generally speaking, what were my thoughts on episode 9 of Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush? If I'm gonna be honest, I thought this was a pretty surprisingly good episode, and it was definitely an episode that I didn't think kind of deserved to be as good as it was, because obviously going into this episode, we were expecting Manabu to duel against a dog, and, obviously hasn't been the first time that we've seen characters duel against animals before. You had Judai versus the monkey in GX, you had Kathy versus that dog in Zexal, and then even in the last show, you had Luke versus the pigeon. And in my opinion, those three episodes, I've never really cared about. Probably the best one was probably Judai versus the monkey, even though that's not really saying too much because I didn't really think it was a great episode, but just the other ones I either just didn't care about, either they were a waste of time or they were just not a good episode. But this one was a very fascinating episode, to say the least. So the episode starts off with us getting prepared for the next duel during the TV programming, and we know that London was supposed to be the next one to duel, as he ended up losing his spot to go first because Mauna had took over, or at least that's what it was implied. So London, once again, is not participating because Mauna wanted someone special to actually duel in the next round. And it also seemed like Yuhi was going to be the next one, but Mauna had called Manabu from the crowd because he was actually participating in the TV programming, or he was at the TV programming, because of the fact that, he had gotten word that there was an alien there besides Udius, and he went there to go and investigate that, but because, he got in trouble with the people at the TV station, he just became part of the crowd, but Mauna called him out, so he went on stage to actually go and duel instead of Yuhi. And what I think is very fascinating about this is that they're kind of hinting at a London versus Yuhi duel, or I just feel like that might be the duel, or I guess maybe it could also be London versus Udius. I think it's one of those two duels, but more than likely it's probably supposed to be Yuhi versus London, because of the fact that in both this episode and the last episode, they've been hinting at these characters supposed to be participating in this TV broadcasting and dueling, whether or not they're dueling against each other or not, and that was the plan. Who really knows, because obviously a lot of things have been being changed last minute. I mean, Mauna went first instead of going last, and then we find out that the dog, which we find out the name is Bochi, is supposed to be dueling against Manabu. So we don't really necessarily know what the original matchups were going to be, but there is kind of a hint towards London versus Yuhi, or it's just very convenient that both of those two characters were supposed to duel in both the last episode and this episode. So, I don't know if that's what they're trying to imply was supposed to happen, but I don't know, it might just be a convenience. More than likely, it's probably just a convenience, but I don't know, that might be a pretty interesting matchup down the line. Kind of seeing a Kirishima versus an Oda would be pretty fascinating for the show, but obviously, that's not the point of this episode. The point of this episode is Manabu versus Bochi, and at first, it kind of seems a little bit weird because you have this small dog that's supposed to be dueling. However, there's two things that end up happening with the dog. First thing is that it starts to speak, and the reason for that is because we learned that this dog is actually an alien, which actually makes sense and kind of ties into the last episode, because like I mentioned earlier, Manabu was there to go and hunt down an alien that was apparently at the TV programming station, and obviously, it wasn't just Udius, it was a different one, and we found out that Bochi was actually the alien. But not only that, apparently this dog can just go buff for some reason, and I don't know, it's just alien stuff, I guess, but I was not expecting that at all going into this episode. I thought this dog was just going to basically be like maybe on Manya's shoulder or something like that, and basically be telling her how to duel. Like, I didn't really know how it was going to work. I was kind of basically expecting it to be similar to how the pigeon ended up dueling when in Yu-Gi-Oh! 7s when he dueled against Luke, where you just had Chevelle dueling for him, and he was telling him what plays he needed to do. That's what I kind of expected, but nope, he was his own character. He got his own duel disc and everything, and Bochi just dueled all by himself, which made sense because you were able to basically transform into this buff dog-looking character to be able to duel against Manabu. But the more fascinating aspect besides that, which that was just more of, okay, that's kind of expected because, it's an alien thing. And by the way, too, Bochi being the alien, not surprised at all. I think they even kind of hinted it in the last episode because we saw this black, weird shadow feature, which was clearly a dog. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about that, and the fact that Manabu and Neanderstar were in the area when that dog walked into the room and they were detecting an alien. I mean, they kind of hinted at that, or at least in my opinion, they were hinting at that. So I'm not really too surprised by that. What I'm surprised about is that Manabu actually knows about this dog because in the episode, we actually learned that there is a backstory between these two characters, which was very fascinating to say the least. But real quickly, we need to get into the duel between Manabu and Bochi. And my thoughts on the duel, I thought it was a pretty interesting duel. Obviously, we got to see Bochi's deck for the first time, which was a dog-focused deck. No surprise there whatsoever. Had a pretty cool ace monster, in my opinion. And this being Manabu's second duel, because remember, the only other time that Manabu has dueled in the show was against Yugioh, and obviously that was more towards like the tutorial aspects of the show, which this episode did have a tutorial aspect in it, and I wasn't a big fan of that, and I didn't really mention it in the last episode either because they did the same thing as well, but can we please stop with these tutorial duels? I mean, this is now 9 episodes that they're doing this. Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate on this, and, at least when it comes to this, it's just like 30 seconds or something like that. They're not really taking too long to explain this, but this shouldn't have been explained already. Like, you could have explained this in the duel that he had against Kawaii Tell. You could have made something work in that scenario to where, you can actually do this in that tutorial episode and not waste until we get to episode 9 and you're still explaining crap. Like, this stuff, although it was very short, so it didn't really affect the duel, because it was short, why couldn't you just put it in the other tutorial duels? You're telling me you didn't have 30 seconds for the last episode, it explained about field spells. You're telling me you couldn't took that 30 seconds to basically explain the field spells when you were explaining about spell cards in episode 3 when we had Yuumu versus Chupataro. Like, you couldn't really explain that? Like, that to me made no sense. And this episode was, explained, like, you can bring back monsters from the graveyard. Like, that stuff, I think is fine, I guess, for its own unique episode, because there wasn't really an episode that maybe it would fit in. Besides, honestly, in my opinion, probably like episode 5 with the Yui and Kawaii Tell duel, because that one was just explaining about defense position monsters and stuff like that. And since it was talking about monsters, maybe you could add that aspect to it. And, since they were explaining traps as well, maybe Kawaii Tell had a trap to bring back a monster from the graveyard, so you could have explained that as well instead of just explaining traps again, even though you did it in episode 4. So that was one of my minor nitpicks with the episode and last episode, and I didn't mention it as well, so I just decided to bring it up here, because we don't need to continue with this whole crap that every episode has to have some sort of tutorial to it. Like, we just don't need it. The fact that only really one episode didn't have a tutorial aspect, which was when Yugioh faced off against Mitazuku, and I guess you could say there was a tutorial about, like, misplaying and stuff like that, but I don't really count that as a tutorial. Just Yugioh messed up. It's a crucial part of any game that you play. You're going to mess something up, and it's going to bite you in the butt, whether you're playing a card game, a video game, whatever the case might be. That made sense, but I wouldn't really consider it like a tutorial duel, if that makes any sense. So, I don't know. I just feel like they really need to stop doing this whole thing where every duel that we have in the show, they have to stop at some point to do some sort of tutorial part of the episode. Like, we don't need to continue to do that, in my opinion. So that's something I really do hope that they stop very, very soon, because this is just getting ridiculous that we're 9 episodes into the show and we're still having to explain crap. And yes, I know we still gotta explain maximums and fusions at some point, but at that one I'm a little bit more willing to, exclude, because of the fact that, those are more special to the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And they deserve their own episode a little later down the line. I'm completely fine with that. But this crap about learning stuff from the graveyard and field spells, nah, I do not like that at all. But getting back into the duel, sorry, I kind of went off there a little bit, but what was cool about Manabu in this episode was that, we got to see a little more development from him, not only from his backstory, but also as a duelist, because not only did we get to see him in action again since that UDS duel, but we actually got to see his ace monster in this episode, which was a really sick monster in my opinion, and definitely one of the higher ace monsters for me throughout the show. My personal favorite is probably still Galactic Oblivion. I absolutely love the design of that ace monster, and I think this card is a pretty close second in my opinion, with maybe like the Bluetooth Burst Dragon being up there as well. Like, those are probably my top 3 like ace monsters of the show so far. I really do love those 3 ace monsters. Not saying the other ones were terrible or anything like that. It's just like those 3 are like the top tier ace monsters for me in my opinion. So it was really cool to see Manabu's ace monster for the first time, because we didn't get to use his ace monster in a duel against Yugioh, so to be able to see it in this episode was great to see. But obviously the biggest thing to take away from this episode was the backstories that we learned in this episode, and boy oh boy did we have some pretty interesting backstories. So to start off with the backstory, we have Manabu, who is part of the Shugetsu style family, which, they brought up Shigetsu style. Not really surprised by that. That was something a lot of people had been talking about, on whether or not that's going to be a concept with Manabu's character, and it looks like that was going to be the case. And just like everything else from the show so far, it has something that is different from its 7's counterpart, because this is more serious on, martial arts and all that stuff, and a little bit more of a serious group when it comes to like fighting and all that stuff, where they basically are willing to go into war and fight. So, we get to learn about that, and obviously that's a little different from the Shigetsu style that we learn. They're more physical, they're more brutal, while in 7's, they were trying to be more calm, or at least that's the perception I got from 7's. So, they wanted to make a difference there. Not surprised, they've been doing this the entire show, which I'll real quickly go over that. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I really do hope with these next couple of episodes, can we please stop with every episode we needing to have some tie in the 7's? Like, seriously, besides episode 5 and maybe episode 7, I was going to be very confident on that, but someone brought up to me about the pigeon that flew on the truck of Yuhi when they were doing that whole thing of trying to train Udias with like the attributes and types and all that stuff, and that bird ended up flying onto the vehicle that made them actually drop. A lot of people brought up to me that that pigeon might have been a reference to the pigeon from 7's, even though I didn't really see that comparison, because I just thought, oh, it's a bird, it's just everyday bird. But because people did bring up the whole aspect of that, and just kind of looking at what this show has been doing since the beginning of this show, honestly, like, I wouldn't really be surprised if that's the case. So, even though I don't really think it was too much, I just think it was a normal bird flying on the truck, and that was all. If you want to consider that episode, then episode 5 has really been the only episode where I didn't really think about 7's at all, which this show needs to do, because I don't care if this show is tied in with 7's or not. The thing is that you can't let this show stand on its own 2 feet if you continuously do the concept of every episode has to be some tie-in with 7's. Like, that's an aspect of the show that I feel like either needs to stop entirely or just needs to slow down, because this is just getting ridiculous. Like, every episode, it has to be like, oh, this is the same thing that happened to 7's, but a little bit different, or, this is the same last name as another character, but it's obviously a different character, and it doesn't seem to be like a tie-in, aka hinting at the older people of the show. Like, that just, in my opinion, needs to calm down, because I'm getting sick and tired of every episode we have to bring up 7's, because, not saying it's not a great thing to bring up 7's, and I don't care if they want to pay some tribute to the last show, I have no issue with that. But when every episode's doing it, it's like, okay, you're kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit, and you need to start to slow down a little little bit, because not every episode needs to be discussing something with sevens or hinting at, more specifically, stuff from sevens, but doing something different for Go Rush. Like, you don't really need to do that. You need to let this show stand on its own 2 feet and do some things that are unique and not have to use similar aspects of sevens or use similar names from sevens. Like, you don't need to continuously do that every single episode. Like, that is something that this show desperately needs to change as soon as they possibly can. But getting back into it, we get to learn about Manabu's backstory, and one day he was walking home and he ran into Bochi just in the street, and he starts hanging out with the dog, and he became best friends with the dog. But when his father, grandfather, whatever that character was, that older character, saw that he was messing with this dog instead of doing his training, he basically got scolded for that and was forced to be taken away from the dog. And when he went back to go and visit the dog was gone, and that made him very sad, because he didn't know if something ended up happening to him because he was hanging out with him. He didn't know if his members of the Shigetsu style family had something to do with it and disposed of the dog. Like, they didn't know what had ended up happening, and it broke Manabu's heart because he grew so attached to this dog. And from Bochi's perspective, it was very interesting as well, because Bochi was this alien group where basically their entire point of their cluster was basically they would act as these small dogs, and when your person is not paying attention and basically looking away from them for that brief second, they turn into these buff dogs and just basically knock you out and basically leave at that point. So it was very interesting to learn about that, and this duel kind of had a whole new twist to it, because obviously Bochi was targeting Manabu because he wanted to attack the Shigetsu style family compound, and obviously that's to try and motivate Manabu more, because spoiler alert, we kind of learn later on in the episode that basically he was doing it as an act. But instead of like last episode where he was just acting the entire time, and this wasn't the case at all, because even Udius had confirmed that the cluster did this. But we learned that Bochi did have a change of heart when he actually met Mauna after Manabu had disappeared and never went back to go and visit him. He started hanging out with Mauna more and ended up changing as a character. So that was pretty cool as well, and definitely they did it a lot better than the last episode, though I will say this, although I do think they did better than the last episode with, where the last episode was Mauna just acting the entire time, and, the whole entire episode was just her basically acting. This episode was more like, this how I originally was, but Mauna did change my heart, but I wanted to kind of tell that part of my backstory to kind of push you more to defeat me. Like, that aspect I loved about it. The only thing I didn't like about it is that you literally reused the same storyline that you did in the last episode, where a character was putting on an act to basically push their opponent. Like, that, in my opinion, I really feel like they shouldn't have done that. Obviously, I do think this is the better one because it made a lot more sense than the Mauna one, but let's not continuously copy same aspects that we basically did from the last episode, because we didn't really need to have a similar episode where it was just trying to push a character and basically putting on an act. Like, we don't need to do that every single episode. But besides that, the stories was great. Learning about Manabu's backstory was great, and just kind of realizing that he does have a pretty tough childhood, because he's kind of forced to have to follow in his family's footsteps because he is a Shigetsu. He should be following the Shigetsu style, but he doesn't want to follow it. And, that's where I kind of do have some respect for Manabu, because I'm going to be honest, I haven't really liked Manabu at all in this show, and it's not because he's done anything bad per se. It's just that, he just feels like that Team Rocket-esque kind of character, and I'm not really a big fan of that. And, this episode, kind of diving more into his backstory, really made me to respect Manabu a lot more as a character, and that's definitely a character that's grown on a lot for me throughout this entire show, and just learning that backstory of Manabu definitely shot up his character, in my opinion. But with that being said, that's going to be it for this episode review. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know your guys' thoughts on episode 9 of Go Rush. Did you like the episode? Did you think the episode was okay? Or are you not the biggest fan of the episode? Let me know your guys' thoughts on Manabu versus Bochi and whether or not you like the duel or not, as well as the backstory that we got between these two characters. And let me know your guys' thoughts on the tutorials that we've been getting throughout these last couple of episodes. Has it not really been that big of a bother to you? Or have you really gotten tired of these tutorial duels? And do you believe that they need to stop now? And basically give me your overall thoughts on the episode as a whole. But with that being said, that's going to be it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, guys, take care and have yourselves a great rest of your day.